Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor, Simone de Beauvoir and her husband Jean-Paul Sartre, Lennon and McCartney. Every once in a while, a partnership comes along, the power of which far surpasses the two as individuals. Take these two, Michele Landsberg and Stephen Lewis. Alone, they are formidable. Together, an absolute force to be reckoned with. As a journalist, Michele has chronicled the struggle for women's equality in Canada.
When a member of Parliament, a woman, stood up to discuss spousal abuse in the House, many of the men laughed.
As an activist, Stephen has led the charge against HIV/AIDS through the Stephen Lewis Foundation.
Turning the tide on AIDS in Africa is the way we intend to do it at community level.
In fact, activism has been one of the pillars of their 49-year marriage. 49 years, that's a long run, especially for a couple who'd only known each other 6 weeks before they tied the knot. At the time, their parents, how do you think they react to that idea? We'll get into it. Plus, Stephen and Michele were determined to do things their own way, just as they have in their fight for women's equality. They embraced feminism at a time when chauvinism dominated the culture. We'll talk about those days, what it takes to keep a marriage going when both partners are fiercely committed to their work. This is a real treat. Please welcome Michele Landsberg and Stephen Lewis. Hey, Michele, nice to see you. How are you?
Great.
Excellent. Thanks for coming. Stephen, good to see you, bud. Thanks for coming. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's a great book. It's this collection of all these articles over the course of your career. What's the process like for you?
Process was horrible. There were 3,000 columns that I wrote over the 25 years, and I had to winkle out the ones that I thought still had some resonance or fun.
And
so,
well, fun, that's a difficult one in some of the columns,
yeah.
right?
Not all of them were fun.
No, for sure. So let's just, feminism, like what does it mean to you now?
Let's start with the small stuff, by all means.
Well, define it. Define feminism.
It is the passion for equality and for justice. And for women, for men, for children. It's that determination to have equality and justice and fairness.
So many of the conversations we have had center around the fact that if you want to deal with a lot of the challenges in the developing world, certainly as it relates to HIV/AIDS, it's about the equality of women. We've talked about that a lot. So how do we just get to it and make it a better place for women and make it a more equal place for women? What has to be done?
Well, we don't do it. It's the people on the ground who do it for themselves, and that's happening. It's happening all around the developing world. You know, I was stunned to read the other day that women in Yemen, one of the more oppressive regimes in the world, were burning their veils in protest. The women in Saudi Arabia are risking a flogging and imprisonment to drive, something they're not allowed to do, as you know. So all around the developing world, in Tunisia, the women led the revolution. It's happening. They're on the same path that we in North America were on a couple of decades ago.
When there's major changes in the area, you saw it to a degree in Egypt, Tunisia, and even in Libya, the request was, is the rest of the world with us? Is the international community on our side? In the case of these women you're talking about, in these instances, is the outside world doing enough to let them know?
I know that there's been connection for decades between, for example, Muslim women. There's an organization called Women Living Under Muslim Laws. There are many other organizations for progress and feminism that connect with feminists on this side of the oceans. So, yeah, there's a lot of connection, not so much money flowing. The practical help is much harder to achieve. But the moral support, information, support in law cases, that happens. There's a huge international connection.
There's a connection.
Yeah.
But where the real intervention should occur, it doesn't occur because men still call the shots. So if you're dealing with the United Nations and the response to some of these struggles, there is no commitment to gender equality except rhetorically. You would, by and large, agree with that, I think.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it drives you crazy because the absence of gender equality, the absence of taking seriously the most important Millennium Development Goal, as they call it, is insufferable for women. The oppression continues.
So when you say there's no commitment to it, and you raise these issues, what kind of responses would you get?
You'd get a passive indifference. You get an unwillingness to be engaged. For example, 7 or 8 days ago, the Global Fund on AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria found itself in such a difficult position financially that they had to cancel what they call their next round in 2012. That's canceling more than $1 billion worth of support for interventions which are primarily directed to women. I mean, it's the women who will suffer and die in the thousands because the European countries are defaulting on their commitments. And there's just something about it when you talk about the needs for women and the rights of women, you're always in a struggle. Yes, women internationally support each other, but there's still a lot of work to do on the men.
Go back to those days in school and university when the conversation about feminism was very different, wasn't it?
Well, people think that the big revolution in society happened in the 1960s, but I always remind people the 60s didn't happen until 1968. And when I was in university in the early 60s, one of the first conversations about this, I remember I said to one of my fellow students, a young man, well, it's shocking that there aren't any women writers on our entire course. And he started to say, well, no woman has ever written a great novel.
But was he reflective of other cats in your class?
Yeah? Absolutely. And I started to argue with him and say, well, women are just as intelligent as men. I never got to finish that sentence because he was so astonished. He burst out laughing that I could say anything so obviously ridiculous.
Right.
And that was the tenor of the times.
What was your experience like at that time?
I was probably a sexist pig at that time. I mean, being honest, I've never known why Michele married me, to tell you the truth. And she has frequently said that it took her 20 years to turn me into a human being. And that's probably and that's probably true. But I mirrored the chauvinism of the day. I can remember when two of us led a campaign for the CCF on campus during the mock parliament. Our poster consisted of a scantily clad Swedish model, and the insignia
for the CCF,
and the insignia. do you need therapeutic intervention? Are you going to go right over there? And the words read, "If socialism can do this for Sweden, imagine what we can have at the University of Toronto." Fantastic. And I was so you see, I was almost beyond redemption, salvaged by Michele.
She really was a big part of informing your relationship with the subject, right?
Yes, because my commitment to socialism was not the same commitment to feminism. And the fact that I understood the struggle for gender equality and how important feminism was is directly attributable to Michele, because my own father, of his generation, was, to put it mildly, an anti-feminist. Right. Well, neutral on feminism, and wondered why in God's name I had married this woman.
He just said, listen, it's never going to be quiet in that house. Is that what he said to you?
No, actually, what my mom said was, do you have to, son?
I told you it was different back then.
It sure was. What did your people think of him?
My mother cried for a couple of weeks. She kept saying, but what does he do for a living?
How did you answer that?
I said, you don't understand. We're going into politics.
Well, what's interesting about you guys, and I wonder how, I mean, the fact that your relationship has lasted as long as it has, and after the commercial break, we'll find out how you pulled off 49 years, which is insanely amazing. But how much has the work informed the stability of the relationship and played a role in keeping it together?
Well, hugely, because people used to think that men were in politics and women put up with this terrible disruption to their family life. But in fact, I don't know how it is for all other political wives, but I believed very deeply in what Stephen was doing, and I felt we were in it together. We were in it together. You know, I had to pay a price. I didn't have him at home all the time, and, you know, it wasn't exactly what you call a normal life, but the work was very important to me, as important as it was to Stephen.
And you pursued, through your columns, which is evident when I look at them now, the same issues. You know, I would fight for something in the legislature. In fact, Michele was fighting in a much larger audience base for the same kinds of social justice. So the lives overlapped in those terms.
A big part of this, too, is educating young boys. It's not as much about just educating young women, but really...
Truer words were never spoken. Yeah. The boys have not changed so much, and they need to, desperately. You know, sexism just pervades the classroom. It seeps through the entire curriculum and the whole structure of the school. And when that began to change, in the 70s and 80s, when people began to realize the way girls were prevented from excelling in math and science by so many messages embedded in the structure, when they changed that, the girls just surged ahead in math and science.
And now you have the torrent of crocodile tears for the young boys. You know, that they're somehow being surpassed.
Yeah.
And their transcendent value isn't being appreciated.
Right.
In truth, what has happened is that the girls have finally been allowed to find their way.
Yeah, and we should just go through this equally anyway. There's no
Yeah.
surpassing anybody.
Yeah,
Exactly.
precisely.
All right, stick around. We're going to have more of a conversation with Michele and Steve. I want to find out about how you keep 49 years. How do you make a marriage last for 49 years? More with Stephen and Michele right after this.
I ask you today not to pass the kind of resolution that will saddle the new Democratic Party with the need of defending itself and NATO for years to come. I ask you today to unite again behind Tommy Douglas, to unite again behind him in the policy which he asked us last night to support.
Love that clip. We're back with Michele Landsberg and Stephen Lewis. That's Stephen's father.
You don't realize the significance of that clip. He was talking about NATO. And I opposed him on the floor of that convention as a young kid. And he shot me down ruthlessly in the presence of thousands of delegates. I can't get over that. I haven't seen that clip in years and years.
That's a long time ago. What's it like when your old man has taken you to task?
Oh, he has no mercy. That's what it was like. I was ideologically on the wrong side as far as my dad was concerned, and he didn't care about familial instincts. He just got rid of me in the presence of all these delegates.
I know there's no one secret to a lasting relationship, but I think of all the things you've accomplished in your life, and many have been really important globally, 49 years together as a couple is remarkable. How do you do that?
Please answer.
Because you don't know.
He doesn't have a clue. How did we do that? Well, people ask that a lot, and I've had to think up an answer. The answer really is that our shared beliefs. That really, we're not focused on each other nitpicking over little slights and things that go wrong. We're focused outward on a goal that we both share, and we have the deepest respect for each other's ideals, beliefs, and accomplishments. And Stephen is so supportive, far beyond what most men are expected to be in a relationship. He's very supportive of my work. And then there's that hidden factor. Absence.
Yes, exactly.
He's on the road so much. You know, this gives us both a bit of space to breathe. It really does. I think it's important.
And to miss each other.
Miss each other, have separate lives and separate interests, and then come back refreshed to each other. Yeah.
I rarely made a speech of significance, or what I thought was of significance, without checking out the content with Michele. I read Michele's columns, the more
Before
difficult,
I sent them in.
more controversial ones. We just kept on sharing over the years, constantly, quite apart from the bringing up of children, sharing all the work we did back and forth, and it's very bonding. And then at moments of friction, I would leave town.
See, because that's what I think. I think the art to this is not how well do you get along with somebody, but how compatible are you as fighters? Because when you fight in a relationship, can you pull that off in a compatible way?
What a good point. And we had to learn that.
Yes.
I think we both learned a lot about how to fight.
We are fiery people, so I can imagine those explosions would be massive.
Well,
I was oppressed and often pummeled into submission.
oh, nonsense.
But I rebounded. I have resilience.
Maybe verbally.
That's true.
I was just asking a question about the UN report that just came out on HIV/AIDS, and there's some general positivity in this new report.
Yes, although without wanting to be unduly negative, in order to be positive, they have to compare what is happening today with what happened 10 years ago. If you look at it year on year, for example, there were 1.8 million deaths from AIDS in 2010. There were 1.8 million in 2009. In 2009, there were 2,600,000 new infections. In 2010, 2,700,000 new infections. So when you look at it year by year, the progress incrementally is heartbreaking because it's hardly progress at all. So they have to go way back, and they're making these very positive statements, George, in order to persuade the donors to keep funding. That's what it's all about.
So maybe you have to do that then, whatever it takes to get the money in, right?
I guess, although it warps the response to the pandemic.
There you go. Check it out. The book here is called Writing the Revolution from Michele Landsberg, and thanks for bringing your fellow along with us. Stephen Lewis. We'll be right back. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor, Simone de Beauvoir and her husband Jean-Paul Sartre, Lennon and McCartney. Every once in a while, a partnership comes along, the power of which far surpasses the two as individuals. Take these two, Michele Landsberg and Stephen Lewis. Alone, they are formidable. Together, an absolute force to be reckoned with. As a journalist, Michele has chronicled, especially for a couple who'd only known each other 6 weeks before they tied the knot. At the time, their parents, how do you think they react to that idea? We'll get into it. Plus, Stephen and Michele were determined to do things their own way, just as they have in their fight for women's equality. They embraced feminism at a time when chauvinism dominated the culture. We'll talk about those days, what it takes to keep a marriage going when both partners are fiercely committed to their work. The struggle for women's equality in Canada.
When a member of Parliament, a woman, stood up to discuss spousal abuse in the House, many of the men laughed.
As an activist, Stephen has led the charge against HIV/AIDS through the Stephen Lewis Foundation.
Turning the tide on AIDS in Africa is the way we intend to do it at community level.
In fact, activism has been one of the pillars of their 49-year marriage. 49 years, that's a long run.
That I wrote over the 25 years, and I had to winkle out the ones that I thought still had some resonance or fun.
And
so,
well, fun, that's a difficult one in some of the columns, right?
Not all of them were fun.
No, for sure. So let's just, feminism, like what does it mean to you now?
Let's start with the small stuff, by all means.
Well, define it. Define feminism.
It is the...
This is a real treat. Please welcome Michele Landsberg and Stephen Lewis. Hey, Michele, nice to see you. How are you?
Great.
Excellent. Thanks for coming. Stephen, good to see you, bud. Thanks for coming. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's a great book. It's this collection of all these articles over the course of your career. What's the process like for you?
Process was horrible. There were 3,000 columns.